Welcome to The Explainer. You know, sometimes a huge story can start with just a few words. Today, we're going to unpack exactly that. A really complex story where climate policy, international trade, and human rights all crash into each other. And it all kicked off with one pretty stunning exchange on Parliament Hill.
So it all starts with this question, asked in a parliamentary committee. And wow, did it spark a political firestorm. But to really get what this moment means and why it's so important, we got to look at the backstory. Let's dig in.
Okay, so picture this. It's March 26th, 2026. The House Industry Committee is looking into Canada's big new electric vehicle policy. And a Liberal MP, Michael Ma, starts questioning an expert witness, Margaret McEwen-Johnston. He's asking her about reports of forced labor in China, and then he drops this, suggesting her information is basically just hearsay. And the fallout? It was immediate. Now get this, Ma's question was actually about the city of Shenzhen, but it got misreported at first as being about the Xinjiang region, which, as you can imagine, just poured fuel on the fire. The whole thing just blew up. It took over the committee, it spilled right into the House of Commons, and in the end, Ma, who by the way had just recently crossed the floor to join the Liberals, he had to issue a public apology for his line of questioning. And the expert witness, Margaret McCoy-Johnston, said she was, and this is her word, dumbfounded. I mean, her reaction really shines a light on just how incredibly hard it is to get that kind of direct, first-hand proof of these human rights abuses. So it makes you wonder, right? What was this committee meeting even about to cause such a firestorm? Well, they were looking at a brand new policy on electric vehicles. And this policy wasn't just pulled out of thin air. Nope, it came directly from a trip to China that Prime Minister Mark Carney took just a few months before. And guess who else was on that trip? Yep, MP Michael Marr. Okay, let's just lay out the timeline here, because the timing is everything in this story. So, look at this. In December 2025, MP Michael Ma makes a big move. He crosses the floor to join the Liberals. Then, just 1 month later, 1 month, he's on the official government trip to Beijing with Prime Minister Carney. And it's on that very trip that this huge new trade deal gets announced. Kind of makes you go, right? So what's the big deal with this deal? Well, the heart of it is this new quota. It opens up Canada's market to, get this, 49,000 Chinese-made EVs every single year to start. And that's not all. That number is going to jump to 70,000 within just 5 years. Now, this is a massive policy reversal. We're talking about dropping a 100% surtax, which basically blocked these cars from the market, all the way down to a standard 6.1% tariff. That's a game changer for making these EVs way more affordable for Canadians. But, and it's a big but, back in Ottawa, this deal started raising some really tough questions. Right. So after the Prime Minister gets back from China, this one critical question starts to bubble up everywhere. When he was meeting with Chinese President Xi behind closed doors, did our Prime Minister actually bring up Canada's concerns about human rights? And this, my friends, is where the story gets really weird, because we have two completely different stories. In January, the Prime Minister stands in front of reporters and says, yes, I talked about human rights with President Xi. But then in March, an official government document shows up in Parliament and it says, and I'm quoting here, that human rights and foreign interference were not brought up proactively by the Prime Minister. So which one is it? Well, that contradiction didn't stick around for long. Just a few days later, the Prime Minister's office yanks that document back. They called it an error and said it was a mistake made by public servants. Then, a brand new, corrected version gets sent over to Parliament. This time, the wording is, well, it's different. It says human rights were raised proactively at multiple levels, including by the Prime Minister. See the change? Critics immediately jumped on this, calling it semantic gymnastics and, my personal favorite, narrative repair. Okay, let's just step back for a second and connect the dots. We've got a controversial hearsay comment from an MP, we've got a massive new trade deal for electric cars, and we've got this really confusing back and forth from the Prime Minister's own office. So what is going on here? How does all this stuff fit together? Well, one theory out there is that these aren't just a bunch of random, isolated incidents. The thinking is that this might actually be a sign of a very deliberate pivot in Canada's policy towards China, especially when it comes to the super sensitive topic of human rights. So let's look at the evidence for this policy pivot idea. People who believe this is happening point to a few key things. First, before he became Prime Minister, Carney didn't have a public record of condemning the forced labor situation in Xinjiang. Second, this new EV deal,
It involves supply chains that human rights groups have very credibly linked to forced labor. Third, if you look closely, the government's own language on this has gotten, well, a lot more general. And last but not least, some people see MP Ma's whole hearsay line of questioning as a kind of trial balloon, testing the waters for a softer government stance. When you line all that up, it starts to look like a potential choice was made. Maybe ease up on publicly calling out specific abuses in order to get a better economic deal, like, cheaper batteries.
Really, when you strip it all away, this entire thing, from that tense moment in the committee room all the way up to the PMO, it all comes down to a classic dilemma. And it's one that a lot of countries are wrestling with right now.
And here it is, the core tension. On one side, you have this really practical, really urgent need for cheap green technology. We need affordable EVs to hit our climate targets, right? But on the other side, you have our country's moral principles and, not to mention, actual laws that say we can't import goods made with forced labor. They're pulling in opposite directions.
So you see the problem. It's a trade-off with no easy answer, and it leaves us with a really fundamental question. When a country's economic goals clash with its stated moral values, which one bends? As we push for a greener future, all of this makes you stop and think. What is the real price of that battery?